He had spent 11 years teaching himself not to look too long at a German shepherd, and a single January storm undid all of it before the night was over. The nor'easter came up the Atlantic, the way the bad ones always did off northern Cape Breton, fast and personal, throwing the ocean against the cliffs below Carrick Cove until the whole headland shook. Emmett Vance stood on the porch of his cabin with a mug of cold coffee he had forgotten he was holding, watching the snow go sideways across the dooryard and bury the woodpile he'd stacked that morning. He was 60 broad in the shoulders the way old soldiers stay broad, with a close gray beard and a face the weather had been working on for a decade. There was a pale seam under his left eye, where something sharp had come close once and missed the rest of him. He had been a U.S. Navy SEAL until the Navy decided a man could be too old to be useful, though nobody had ever explained that to the parts of him that still woke at 0500 listening for orders that weren't coming. He had come north after Marin died. People in Murchison Bay assumed he was American running from something, and they weren't entirely wrong, but the thing he was running from had no border and no name on a map. His wife had been gone 3 years now. The cabin she'd wanted to renovate sat half-renovated, the trim in the back bedroom still unpainted, because finishing it would have meant admitting she wasn't coming to see it done. He kept the place like a vessel run by one tired hand, clean, spare, cold in the corners. There was exactly one photograph on the mantel, and it was turned a quarter toward the wall so he could pretend not to see it on his way to the wood stove. In the photo, a younger Emmett knelt in desert tan beside a dog. Bishop had been 90 pounds of dark sable shepherd, black across the muzzle, with eyes that took a room apart and put it back together before anyone else had finished blinking. Bishop had found the things buried in roads that were meant to kill boys. Bishop had slept against Emmett's boots in countries where sleep was a kind of dare. And Bishop had died on the last mission either of them ever ran, looking up at Emmett with no blame in him at all, only a question. Are we leaving? And that look had outlived the dog by 11 years and would, Emmett suspected, outlive him too. That was the part he couldn't carry. Not the blast, the trust. The trust had no decency. It just kept being there after the thing that earned it was gone. So he hated shepherds now, or told himself he did. He hated the pricked ears and the noble heads, and the way they made grief stand up and walk around the room on 4 legs. Which was a problem, because a little before 9 o'clock that night, with the storm screaming through the gaps in the cedar shakes, he heard a sound under the wind that was not the wind. It was thin and high and broke off in the middle, the way a cry breaks when the thing making it is running out of whatever lets it cry. He told himself it was a fox. The mountain killed foxes every winter and was not asking his opinion. He sat back down with his book. The sound came again, smaller, and something older than his stubbornness got up before he did and put on his coat. The cold took the breath out of him on the step. He went down toward the tree line with his headlamp, filling the dark with spinning white, his bad knee complaining at every drift. The cry pulling him left toward a windbreak of stunted spruce. He found the box first, a soaked carton half collapsed against a deadfall, the kind somebody throws in a ditch when they've decided a litter is no longer their problem. Then his light caught fur and his stomach dropped. A shepherd bitch lay curled around the box's open mouth, young, maybe 3. Her tan and black coat stiff with ice and the snow already smoothing her over the way the country smooths everything it's done with. She'd put her own body between the wind and her pups, and the wind had taken her for it. Pressed into the cold of her belly were 3 of them, no more than 4 weeks old, one sable, round-bellied and shaking, with paws too big for the rest of him. One black, dead silent, watching Emmett's headlamp with amber eyes that didn't startle, and one small white female, soaked through, trembling so hard she looked like something the storm had only just finished assembling and might unmake again at any second. Of all the things, Emmett thought, of every animal God keeps in the cupboard, it had to be these. The desert opened up under his boots, heat and dust and a dog trying to breathe, and he stepped back. No, he said out loud, because the word was a wall and he needed the wall. If he picked them up he would feel it, and if he felt it something already cracked might break clean through. He turned for the cabin and the fire, and the careful silence he'd spent 3 years building like a man bricking up a window. Behind him came a faint scrape in the snow, The white pup had left the others. Too weak to walk, she hauled herself forward on her belly, one small pull at a time, dragging a thin line through the powder toward him. She didn't bark. She didn't cry. She crawled until she reached his boot and laid her head against the leather and shut her eyes, and the whole storm seemed to go quiet around that one small surrender. Don't go, not you. She weighed nothing. She pressed harder than any order he'd ever been handed. His face came apart for a second the way granite never should. All right, he said, and his voice cracked on the two small words. All right, you stubborn little thing. He went down on both knees in the snow. He put the white pup inside his coat against his bare collarbone, then gathered the silent black one and the shivering sable one and held them to his chest, where they trembled like 3 coals somebody had almost let go out. He looked once at the mother, bowed his head, old respect, the kind he gave fallen people, and stood up into the wind. He kicked the cabin door shut behind him, and the storm vanished like a beast denied. The 3 of them weren't crying anymore, and that frightened him worse than noise would have. Because noise meant fight, and silence meant the cold had started telling them its last quiet story. He worked the way he'd worked in triage tents that smelled of blood instead of wood smoke and old coffee. Down on one knee at the hearth, coat open, pups out, one at a time. The sable came first and shoved at his palm even half frozen, offended by his own weakness. You've got some sand in you, Emmett muttered. Atlas then, carrying the whole sky already. The black one came next and didn't struggle, only looked at him steadily, the way you look at a man whose file you're still deciding how to close. Echo, he said, because the dog gave everything back to you doubled. Last, the white runt, the one who'd crawled. She lolled against his fingers when he lifted her head. He warmed evaporated milk and water on the stove to just above blood heat, no proper formula anywhere within 40 kilometers of plowed road, and fed them off a needleless syringe. Atlas latched and gulped and made a furious squeak. Echo drank with discipline and crawled toward the warm fold of the blanket. The white one barely swallowed. He rubbed her throat with the pad of his thumb and got one drop down, then another, and leaned in close to hear the thread of breath still moving in her. Don't you quit on me, he told her, low. You started this. He named her Willow before he'd decided to keep any of them, and the name felt like a door he'd left unlatched on purpose. That night his back gave him 3 hours, then woke him to a cold room and a fire down to coals. Atlas and Echo had bundled together and were shivering but warm enough. Willow had slipped to the edge of the basket and gone wrong in his hands when he picked her up. Not just cold but emptied, the small flame in her pulled back somewhere he couldn't reach. He found a flutter under his 2 fingers and nothing else. Blankets wouldn't be fast enough. He looked at the wool gloves on the table, the armor he wore so the world couldn't touch him. And then he peeled off his flannel and the thermal under it, sat back in the chair with the cold biting his chest, set Willow directly over his heart, and wrapped them both in the blanket. She lay against him like a handful of January. He breathed slow, on purpose, made his lungs a bellows for the smallest fire on the headland. The storm screamed, the old house ticked and settled, and then her nose moved, hunting blindly along his skin for warmth, and a paw flexed, and under his ribs he felt it. A quick small heartbeat, trying to match the time of his own. Something in him opened without breaking, the way ice gives on a river in spring. Bishop came back to him, not bleeding this time but running, ears up, tongue out the side of his mouth like a fool, and a tear got loose and surprised Emmett with how hot it was on a face that cold. He laid his hand on Willow's wet back and didn't pull away. I've got you, he whispered, and meant more by it than he was ready to say. By the time the snow finally turned to a wet Cape Breton spring, the cabin had stopped being a barracks and become a crime scene with 3 suspects. Atlas, Echo, and Willow were 4 months old, all legs and ears and unearned confidence, growing like the wood itself was feeding them. Atlas had come up biggest, broad-chested, certain that every table leg was an enemy position that needed taking. Echo went quiet and exact, studying hinges and drawers and the order Emmett did things in, the way another dog might study a scent. Willow had grown into a slim cream-white ghost, with a habit of stealing dish towels from every room and dragging them into squares of sun, building nests for kings who never showed. He told himself he hadn't gotten attached. He said it while wiping muddy prints off the counter, while pulling a wool sock out of Atlas's jaws, while waking at first light to find Willow asleep across his boots, and Echo sitting by the bedroom door like he'd been posted there. He had run his life on order, feeding at 6, out at 6:15, the wood split and squared, and the order lasted about 3 days against 3 shepherds before he stopped trying to enforce it and started, without admitting it, to enjoy losing. The trouble came on a raw afternoon with the fog rolling thick off the cove and rain ticking against the glass. He'd gone out back to move firewood under the lean-to and left them inside for what he meant to be 10 minutes and turned into 25. He came back to silence, and a man who has lived with 3 young shepherds knows that silence is not peace. Silence is a conspiracy that has already happened. Echo was under the table, perfectly still, watching his face. Willow sat in the middle of the floor wearing a strip of dish rag like ruined finery, and Atlas stood by the open lower drawer of the sideboard with something hanging from his mouth, something that caught the gray light and clicked against his teeth. Bishop's collar. The real one, not a souvenir gone soft with years, but the actual leather cracked, the brass tag stamped with a name and a war Emmett had buried without a service. The collar he'd carried home in a cargo pocket, and never once been able to throw away. Drop it. His voice came out so quiet all 3 of them froze. Atlas opened his mouth and the collar hit the floorboards with a small sound that detonated something enormous inside Emmett. For 1 full second, he wasn't in Nova Scotia at all. He was in dust and radio static, reaching for a thing he couldn't save. He picked the collar up with shaking hands. There was a fresh tooth dent across the brass, harmless, a puppy's mark, and somehow it looked like a wound. "No," he said, and then louder, sharp enough to flatten Willow's ears. "You're not family. You're animals. You wreck everything you touch." Atlas took 1 uncertain step toward him, with his tail dropping, and Emmett took him by the scruff. Not hard, but rough enough to be ashamed of even as he did it, and put all 3 of them out the back door into the rain. The cabin was clean again. Quiet. He'd begged the world for quiet for 3 years. He sat at the table with Bishop's collar in front of him and discovered the quiet had gone rotten, too big, full of room for the shadows to move. He tried to read. He tried coffee. Every crack of thunder put Willow's flinch back in his chest. When a flash lit the window white, he was up before he could argue himself out of it. Telling the empty room he was only checking the perimeter. He pulled the curtain back, and the next flash opened the dooryard like a photograph. They hadn't gone to the shed. 3 shapes sat in the streaming mud 5 feet from the glass, soaked to the skin, and not one of them was begging. Atlas sat in the center with his head lifted toward the black tree line. Willow pressed to his right, rain running off her muzzle. Echo sat nearest the window, his body angled outward at the woods, watching the dark instead of the house. He had thrown them into the storm and they had taken up a guard. A sound got out of Emmett that he didn't have a name for. Echo turned at it, crossed to the window, and set 1 muddy paw flat against the glass exactly where Emmett's own hand rested on the other side. There was no anger anywhere in the dog, only a question Emmett knew by heart now. "Are you all right in there?" He went to the door and hauled it open against the wind. "Get in here," he said, his voice breaking under the thunder. "All of you. Now." They came in carrying the whole night with them, mud and pine and cold rain, and Atlas drove his wet head into Emmett's thigh, and Willow licked his hand as if she'd already forgiven him before he'd figured out how to ask, and Echo leaned his soaked weight against Emmett's shin and held it there. Emmett went down on his knees in the mess and put his arms around the 3 of them, and his face in their wet fur. The collar lay forgotten on the table behind him. Loyalty, he understood now, was not a thing stamped in brass and kept in a drawer. It was alive and shivering and muddy and still, against all sense, choosing to stand guard over a man too foolish to deserve it. Summer came up green and loud, the cove full of gulls and the spruce sweating resin in the heat, and the dogs were 6 months old and long-legged and starting to look like the animals they'd be. Emmett told himself he trained them because an untrained shepherd is a dangerous thing, which was true and a coward's truth. Because the real reason was that he needed a language for a love he was too proud to call by its name. Out in the clearing he taught them to sit and stay and heel and come off a whistle, taught them his hand the way he'd once taught men. A raised fist for stop, 2 fingers down for down, a flat palm for wait. Atlas obeyed fast when there was motion in it, and slow when there wasn't, because holding still offended him on principle. Echo learned with an ease that was almost unnerving, answering the lift of a shoulder before the word arrived. Willow learned gently, half her attention always on the other two. Circling back to check on Atlas, waiting with one ear cocked when Echo melted into shadow. Emmett came to read them the way he'd once read a team. Atlas was courage with no brakes. Echo was the thought that came before the act, and Willow was the thread that kept the whole cloth from going to pieces. The coyotes came on an afternoon so hot, even the gulls had gone quiet. Cape Breton's coyotes ran bigger than the western kind, half a wolf in some of them, and this was a lean pair working down the ridge toward the smell of the trash barrel and the dog feed in the shed. Echo rose first, no bark. Just a black ridge lifting along his spine and a growl low in his chest. Willow stood behind him with her tail gone stiff. Atlas was on his feet before Emmett could get the splitting maul out of the round. Back, Emmett said, calm, and the lead coyote kept coming, head low, reading the air. He shouted, raised his arms, made himself a bigger problem than supper was worth. The second one swung wide toward Willow, and that was when Atlas broke. Atlas, no, but the sable dog was already across the grass, all 60 pounds of him, barking with a depth he hadn't earned yet, driving at the flank coyote with the reckless arithmetic of an animal who knew exactly one law: the old man is mine. For a second, the coyote gave ground, startled by the nerve of him. Then it turned and caught him along the shoulder and side of the head, a fast slash of teeth, and Atlas yelped and went down rolling and lay still. The training left Emmett. The seal left him. What was underneath was older than rank. The plain animal rage of something with young to protect. He charged the pair roaring, swung them all into a half-split round beside them, with a crack like a rifle, made himself the loudest and maddest thing on the headland, and Echo and Willow came in from the wings in sharp bursts, never close enough to be caught, filling the clearing with noise and motion until the coyotes decided. The trash barrel wasn't worth the gray-bearded lunatic, and his 3 furies and broke for the trees. Emmett didn't chase. The rage dropped out of him so fast his knees nearly went with it. He threw them all aside and got to Atlas, hands shaking. No, no, you damn fool. Atlas's eyes fluttered. There was blood at one ear and his breathing came in stutters, but when Emmett ran careful fingers along his ribs, the dog groaned and gave one weak thump of his tail. Willow pushed in, licking his muzzle, frantic and tender. Echo stood facing the woods, black and rigid, holding the line. Emmett carried Atlas to the cabin and laid him on the sofa, a place no dog had ever been allowed, and checked his gums and his eyes and his legs, whispering every prayer he claimed not to know. Bruised, stunned, hurting, alive. He sat on the floor beside the couch as the light went out of the windows, Willow curled against Atlas's belly, Echo stretched across the doorway. He laid his hand on Atlas's chest and felt it rise and fall. "You're not a tool," he said into the dim room. "You're not a stand-in for anybody." Atlas let out a long, trusting breath. Emmett bowed his head until his forehead touched the dog's fur. "You're my own," he said, "and the Lord help anything that forgets it." July took its toll on the man before it was done with the dogs. He went into the shed to shift a feed sack that had slumped under a leak, bent and gripped and twisted the way he'd done 1,000 times. But he was 60, not 35, and there was a piece of an old war low in his spine that had only ever been waiting. The pain went off white and total. He dropped to both knees with the sack splitting open beside him, and for a while he couldn't get a full breath. Atlas limped in and shoved his big head under Emmett's arm, trying to lift 200 pounds of man by sheer will. Echo went rigid in the doorway, scanning for the enemy that had put his human down. Willow pressed to his side, shaking, not from fear of the woods, but from the simple, unbearable fact of his pain. It took him the better part of an hour to drag himself from the shed to the cabin, fingers in the grass, boots scraping. 3 shepherds circling in a frantic guard. He got himself onto the bed and told himself 15 minutes. Then he'd get up. Then he'd call Greta Duce down the shore. Then he'd handle it like a grown man, and not an old fool beaten by a bag of feed. But the body had other orders, and afternoon bled into night, and night sank into the kind of fever that drags a man backward through his own years. The ceiling fan became rotor blades. He said names the dogs didn't know. They didn't understand fever. They understood a fallen leader. Atlas took the post at the bedroom door and lay across the threshold with his hunger forgotten under his duty. Echo moved through the cabin, nosing cupboards, hunting for the thing that would fix what his human couldn't say. Willow found the few inches left in the water bowl, drank, came back, climbed onto the bed against every rule he'd ever given her, and pressed her wet muzzle to his cracked lips, carrying water from her mouth to his a little at a time. It wasn't enough. It was ridiculous and messy, and holy the way small mercies are. The third night the fever broke like a dam letting go. He came awake gasping, sure the room had shrunk around him, the old panic in him wearing the mask of dying. He couldn't pull a full breath. He clawed at the blanket. Echo moved first. The black shepherd climbed up onto him with a calm that seemed older than instinct, and lowered his whole 60 pounds across Emmett's chest and ribs, spreading the weight even. His head beside Emmett's ear. Emmett groaned and pushed weakly at him, and the dog didn't budge, just held, warm and solid, and the pressure forced Emmett to slow, to stop running inside his own body, to breathe against the weight instead of away from it. Echo let out one long deep breath, and Emmett's trapped lungs followed it. In, out. The desert faded. The cabin came back board by board. Morning came gentle pale light across the floor as if nothing terrible had happened. His back still throbbed, but the fever was gone. Echo slept heavy across his legs. Willow lay curled at his ribs with her white head under his hand. Atlas was still at the door, awake, wrung out, holding. Their bowls were empty, and their eyes were tired, and not one of them had left. Emmett swallowed against the ache in his throat. "You stood post," he whispered, and the words gave out into something with no command left in them. "I thought I was the one saving you." Willow's tail thumped once. "Turns out," he said, "it was the other way the whole time." Autumn laid copper across the highlands, and Emmett did a thing he hadn't done since they were small enough to fit in a laundry basket. He took all 3 of them into town. They couldn't go on being legends hidden in the woods. The world had crowds and children with sticky hands and other dogs with foolish owners, and an animal that's never learned the difference between a threat and a life is a danger to everyone, including himself. So on a bright Saturday he loaded them into the bed of his rusted-out half-ton and drove the shore road into Murchison Bay, where the farmer's market filled the wharf and the smell of cinnamon came off a bakery, and a fiddler was sawing out a reel near the co-op. The town leaned back to make room for 3 shepherds at heel. Conversations thinned. A small boy with a paper cup of cider whispered, "Are those police dogs?" And his mother pulled him gently closer but didn't look away. Atlas walked on the outside, proud, head high. Echo took the storefront side, reading reflections and the feet of strangers. Willow tucked herself just behind Emmett's knee, glancing up now and then to check his breathing the way she had during the fever. They didn't bark. They ignored a terrier in a sweater who insulted them from under a cafe table with the confidence of a creature protected by ignorance, and Atlas only looked at it once, and then looked at Emmett as though to say he'd chosen mercy. "Good call," Emmett murmured. He'd just put them in a down by a bench when a man crossed the wharf toward them, and the man was wrong for the place the way a gold watch is wrong on a lobster boat. He was in his 50s, narrow, with silver hair brushed back too perfectly, and a camel coat that had never once been rained on. Sable male, the man was thinking before he spoke, exceptional bone, look at the head on him, and the thinking was all numbers. "Lyle Thorne," he said, putting out a hand Emmett didn't take. "Thornline Kennels out of Halifax. Protection stock, executive contracts. I know quality when I'm looking at it." He nodded at Atlas. "Is he papered?" "He's breathing," Emmett said. "That was the only paperwork I asked for when I found him." Thorne smiled the way a door closes. "A rescue, then you may not understand what you've got. That dog has presence. If he tests sound, he's worth real money. I'll give you 3,000. The number landed harder than Emmett wanted it to. 3,000 could put a new roof on before the snow. It could fix the half-ton's transmission. Thorne saw the half-second of it cross his face and stepped in. 5 then. Bank draft by Monday. For an unpapered animal, that's more than fair. Atlas rose halfway, not growling yet, only suddenly larger, and Thorne reached a manicured hand toward him. "Let's have a look at that bite." The growl that came up out of Atlas silenced the terrier across the wharf. "Leave it," Emmett said one word, and Atlas stopped, eyes still locked on Thorne. Emmett stood and put himself between them. The little crowd had gone quiet. "You really ought to control your asset," Thorne said. Something in Emmett's face changed. Not heat, something colder and a great deal older. Asset, he said. A working asset. A breeding asset. Don't be sentimental about it. It's only business. Emmett looked down at Atlas, who had taken a half step until his shoulder touched Emmett's leg. He thought of the snow and the coyotes, the fever, the 3 soaked pups sitting guard in the rain over a man too broken to earn them. He looked back at Thorn. You see coat and muscle and money on 4 legs, he said, and his voice carried now, low and level enough that strangers leaned in. I see the one who put himself between me and a pair of coyotes. I see the one who stayed hungry at my door 3 days while I couldn't stand. That's not stock you're looking at, that's blood. Thorn's face went red. It's a dog. No, Emmett said, and the old seal filled the space without lifting a hand. A dog is what you came here to buy. The thing that just told you no, that's something you don't have the money for. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then the boy with the cider said, clear as a bell, good boy, and a few people laughed the soft kind of laugh that breaks a thing open without breaking it. Thorn snapped his coat straight and walked off stiff-shouldered, and Emmett reached down and laid his hand on Atlas's head. Heel, he said, and the 3 of them rose together, and as he led them back through the falling leaves to the truck, he was still poor and still limping and still one bad winter from real trouble, and he could not remember the last time he'd felt so far from broke. Then late fall came, and the gales, and the thing that nearly took everything. It was a stripped-down November day, the brook running high and black off the highlands. When it happened, they were 10 months old and beautiful in the hard light, and a single illegal shot cracked through the trees from somewhere across the line. Careless, too close, and the sound went through the woods like a hammer on steel. Atlas barked, furious. Echo dropped low, hunting the source, and Willow broke. Gunfire reached some deep place in her that no command had ever managed to settle, and she bolted into the gray woods, a white streak gone between the trunks before Emmett's shout could catch her. Willow, stay! But fear was faster than love, and in seconds she was gone, and his stomach turned to ice, because dusk was coming and the temperature with it, and out in that country there were ravines and old leg-hold traps left by people who died years ago, and water cold enough to stop a heart. He clipped Atlas and Echo to their leads and gave the one word that mattered. Track. For 2 hours they pushed through bramble and mud and deadfall while his knee burned and his back screamed the memory of July, the flashlight shaking in his fist as the dark came down. A lantern came swinging up the trail toward him, Greta Duce, 74, slight and sharp-eyed, silver hair under a knit toque, an old hip giving her walk its careful tilt, a heart so stubbornly generous it had been making Emmett feel both grateful and scolded since the day he'd moved north. She'd known Marin a little, before the end, and worse, she remembered the man Emmett used to be. Saw your light cutting up the woods, she said. Figured trouble had found you again. Willow ran, he said. She didn't waste breath on pity. She lifted the lantern higher. Then we bring her home. Echo found the scent near where the brook dropped toward the shore. He froze, nose down, then gave a low urgent whine and pulled Emmett toward the lip of a gully, where the water churned black between the rocks, swollen and shoving toward the sea. Emmett aimed the light down and the beam caught a flash of white on a shelf of stone half under the rising water. Willow barked, high and broken. Her front leg was pinned beneath the surface, and the current was climbing past her chest, and the tide was coming in behind the freshet to meet it. He went down the muddy bank without thinking, tearing his jeans, the alders clawing his hands, Atlas and Echo scrambling after. The cold of the brook hit his legs and drove the air out of him, but he pushed across to her, and she licked his hands frantic, eyes white-edged with terror. I've got you, he said, not yet knowing if it was true. He got his hands under the water and found it. Rusted steel jaws clamped around her paw, an old trap nobody had thrown away, cruel as a forgotten sin. He set his fingers on the springs and shoved. Nothing. The metal refused him. The water shoved back. Emmett, Greta called from the bank. Tie the rope round you. She'd brought her late husband's old hauling line, and she pitched the coil down, and Echo seized the end before Emmett could reach it, and dragged it through the mud with a focus that was almost frightening. Emmett looped it round his waist with numb hands, while Atlas planted himself in the water against his hip, a living anchor. The sable dog who hated cold and deep water both, leaning into the current and growling at it like it was one more coyote come for his family. "Echo," Emmett rasped, pointing at the chain snagged on a root. "Pull." The black dog set his teeth to the chain and backed up, paws digging. Emmett forced the springs. Atlas braced harder. Up on the bank, Greta hauled the line with her whole slight weight, the old hip be damned. The jaws gave, half a centimeter, then a finger's width, and then Willow's paw slipped free and she collapsed against his chest, shaking so hard her teeth clicked. Atlas nearly lost his footing and Echo caught Emmett's sleeve and tugged him toward the bank, and the five of them, old man, old woman, sable courage, black thought, white hope, came up out of that gully together into the dark. Snow came back to Carrick Cove that winter, but the cabin no longer sat there like a vessel waiting to be a tomb. It smelled of wood smoke and cedar and dog, and the brown-bred Greta left on the porch, because she claimed Emmett would starve without supervision. Willow's paw healed with only a stiffness in the cold. Atlas still slept nearest the door. Echo still watched the windows. On the mantel, beside the photograph of Bishop, that Emmett finally turned to face the room. He hung Bishop's old collar, the brass still dented where a puppy tooth had bitten deep. Beside it he set 3 small worn puppy collars, too little now for the guardians they'd grown into, and he stood there a long while saying goodbye. Not to Bishop and not to Marin, but to the guilt that had chained both of them to pain for too many years. Then he stepped out onto the porch into the falling snow. Atlas lay across his boots. Echo sat at his left. Willow rested her head on his knee. The headland was white and quiet, and the quiet didn't feel empty anymore. He had learned the thing the storms had been trying to teach him for 3 winters, that a miracle doesn't always come down with thunder and light. Sometimes it crawls to you through the snow on a paw too small to hold its own weight, and sleeps beside your pain, and stands its post at your door when you've got nothing left to give it, and reminds a man who'd locked every window in himself that love can still find the latch. He set his hand on Willow's white head, and the snow came down soft over the cove, and for the first time in a very long time, the man and his 3 dogs were warm, and home, and nobody was being left out in the cold.